Hi everyone. So yeah, Rachel's already introduced me. Started in Cochrane Central in August. Previously, I've had background work as research assistant for the infectious diseases group, doing systematic reviews. I've worn my Christmas jumper today because it's the Cochrane Central Christmas lunch, but it's in London, so far away from me. I'm based in Liverpool. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about assessing imprecision and inconsistency within grade. I think the reason I picked out these two domains is that mainly because they're the two domains that are partly statistical, and that always scares some of us review authors, including me, but also still with a level of subjectivity to making decisions of whether to downgrade in these two domains. So I'm going to give a quick 15 to 20-minute talk, but feel free to put comments in the chat. I'm also going to be asking questions as I go along, because from past experience of teaching grade, and a lot of these slides are slides I've nabbed from teaching grades to students in the past. I found that it's better to make it as interactive as possible. And at the end of the day, grade is a group sort of decision. So it should just never be done by one person alone. Right, so overview, prerequisite knowledge. Obviously, everyone here is, I imagine, are Cochrane authors or have some capacity of working with Cochrane, so understanding of grade is assumed. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about what we mean by imprecision and consistency, then give some hopefully easy or quite straightforward examples of grading decisions in these domains, and ones that are a bit more tricky. As we all know, there are 5 reasons to downgrade within grades. So 4 main domains that we commonly see in all Cochrane systematic reviews with dealing with interventions. So risk, bias, inconsistency, indirectness, and imprecision, and one other, depending on the amount of trials and whether we can accurately assess publication bias. So what do we mean by inconsistency? So mainly the question is, do the studies have inconsistent effects, and are the studies and their outcomes too heterogeneous to compare? So heterogeneity is normally defined as unexplained variation within your meta-analysis. And then with imprecision is really focusing on the confidence intervals, so your 95% confidence intervals, and the variability around that. So what are some things to consider when we look at imprecision? So like I said, obviously the width of your 95% confidence intervals, if they're available. Also, what is a clinically important difference, and this is much more well established with reviews that are going to be used to inform a guideline group, and especially if they're used for WHO guidelines as a standard practice for the steering group to define the important outcomes and define what they see as clinically important differences. Optimal information size is another factor to take in. So this is how powered your meta-analysis is. And we'll talk about some general rules of thumb for that later. And then finally, it's also important not only to focus on the relative effect, but also the anticipated absolute effects. So as we all know, in the summary of findings table, you're expected to put in the baseline risk, which is normally derived from the control risk of the trials you've included, and then the anticipated absolute effects of that based on your pooled relative risk result. So this is just a figure to illustrate what we mean when we're talking about clinically important effects. So we have appreciable benefits and appreciable harms, which are defined hopefully a priori in your review, either by study authors, review authors, or by a guideline development group. And these will be certain thresholds. And then we can take into that that into account when we look at the width, the confidence intervals to see whether they cross that threshold or they don't. So you might have what might seem as a very wide range of confidence intervals from your lower and upper bound, but because both the lower and upper bound fall as what we will classify as appreciable benefit, that you might be tempted to not downgrade at all, even though the confidence intervals are quite wide. Conversely, you might have quite tight confidence intervals, but because the best case scenario falls into appreciable benefit, but the worst case scenario falls into something that's not clinically important at all, then again, you might be tempted to downgrade for imprecision, despite the numbers themselves looking quite tight. So this is a teaching example that we use in the infectious diseases group, because it's quite a nice review that tells quite a nice story. But hopefully it should be clear enough as to everyone that so imprecision here. So this is artesunate versus quinine in severe malaria. The outcome is death. And see there's a 38% reduction in the risk of death for participants that are randomized to take artesunate compared to quinine. And the confidence intervals range from a best case scenario for a 49% reduction to a worst case scenario of 25%. So I think we can all agree that these are quite tight confidence intervals, because it's mortality, a 25% reduction, and a 49% reduction are both quite clinically important. So no real need to downgrade. But if anyone wants to debate that in the chat, then they're welcome to. And I'm always open to listen to other people's opinions. And then again, hopefully this is an obvious sample of a very imprecise result. So this is from the same review, but a different outcome as an adverse event, which is neurological disability at discharge. And you can see here there appears to be an increase in this adverse event for quinine compared to artesunate. But the confidence intervals are very, very wide. So ranging from 0.64 to 7.63. So almost a 600% increase to a 36% reduction. So very wide and crosses what might be defined as clinically important thresholds. Right, so let's get on to something that might be a bit more questionable. So these are two different types of artesunate combination therapy that are used to treat uncomplicated malaria. And the outcome here is serious adverse events. So you can see just from glancing at it that confidence intervals, again, appear quite wide. One thing that a lot of authors that I found use as a reason to downgrade for imprecision is if the confidence intervals cross a line of no effect. And I don't necessarily agree with this as a sole reason for downgrading for imprecision, purely because, as we've discussed, it's also important to look at clinically important differences. So it may well do cross the line of no effect, but if your lower and upper bound of your confidence intervals are both effects that are not clinically important, then I would argue that's still a precise result. So anyway, we've got these wide confidence intervals here. We've got a massive amount of participants that are actually randomized to groups, but not so many events. So what do people think? And if you put in the chat quickly, and whilst people type in the chat, I actually work out how to open the chat. Would you downgrade for imprecision? And if so, by 1 or by 2? I'll give half a minute, maybe less.
It looks like people are not committing themselves yet to an answer.
No, there's no wrong answers as long as you can give a good reason. So Emma says that she will be tempted to downgrade because of the wide confidence intervals. And Nuala says for 2 levels, so one. Well, they're all flooding in now. Right, so I think most people said they would downgrade. Some say it depends on the anticipated absolute effects. And actually, I agree with that. I haven't. Unfortunately, this review is 2013, I believe the latest one was published. So it's before the Messier standards required it to be mandatory to report adverse events in your summary of findings tables. So we don't actually have the data for the anticipated absolute effects here. And I was too lazy to work them out myself. But the reason why I'm agreeing that we should look at the anticipated absolute effects as well is because in the grade handbook, they actually say when there is a very low event rate, as you see here, which causes confidence intervals around the relative effects to be wide, but sample sizes themselves are sufficiently large. So just look at the numbers randomized, not the number of events. It's likely that there may have been prognostic balance achieved. So it's important to look at the confidence intervals around absolute effects, because those confidence intervals could actually be narrow despite the wide ones from your relative effects. So from that, you actually might not be tempted to downgrade the certainty of evidence for imprecision at all, or downgrade by 1. Personally, without the information of the anticipated absolute effects, I would downgrade by 1. I think, citing both the reasons of low event rates and large confidence intervals. I'm just going to flick to Chrome for another example. This is, I was asking Rachel and Toby and team for other examples, because obviously from my background, most of my examples are quite malaria heavy. So this is one on e-cigarettes for quitting smoking, essentially. I'm just going to remind myself of the outcome for this forest plot here. So this forest plot is looking at the outcome of smoking cessation at 6 months to 1 year. It's split into, you've got 2 groups here, one selected on pregnancy and one child elected a pregnant population here. We're interested purely in the pooled effect. So this is 1.63 and it ranges from 1.3 to 2.04. There's a decent amount of events, so almost 300 total events across the two randomized groups. So what do people think about this one? Would you downgrade? So this is going from 30% increase in quitting smoking to 104% increase. Not downgrade. Yep. So again, most people are in agreement not to downgrade at all. Someone cited the reason because all confidence interval points are beneficial. So I think that's good. I'm gonna reveal the answer for this one, or what the review authors actually did. So yeah, they didn't downgrade. And one of the reasons they didn't downgrade, as you can see, well, they didn't actually give a footnote at all, but I can assume of the reasons they didn't give for downgrading. If you look at the anticipated absolute effects, they go from it appears to be quite low in the population in general. So going from 6 per 100 to 10 per 100, so from 6% to 10%, and those ranges are from 8 to 12%. So it's actually quite a low number of people in terms of the anticipated absolute effects. And so despite the relative effect being quite wide, from 30% to 104% increase, the anticipated difference is fairly low. So yeah, no downgrade for that one. So it's good when the group is in agreement with a published Cochrane review. Right. So on to the second domain, inconsistency. So things to consider for inconsistency, something that we normally like to call the eyeball test, and that's simply just looking at your forest plot and seeing, well, is it obvious that there's just massive variability in the data? And then you might be questioning from that, should you be conducting the meta-analysis at all from this? And then we come to the statistics, which at the moment is normally derived from the I-squared value. And I've taken this quote directly from the Great Handbook, where they talk about thresholds for the I-squared value. So they say, whilst determining what constitutes a large I-squared value is subjective, the following rule of thumb can be used. So blah, 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 but essentially 50 to 90% may be substantial, and 75 to 100% may be considerable. So one of the key take-home messages I want to take away from this MSU clinic is to move away from using thresholds, especially for making decisions to downgrade for inconsistency. So what should we do instead? Well, I think it's important to consider the type of heterogeneity, so whether it's quantitative or qualitative, and I'll go into further detail what I mean about that later. And also, obviously, where possible, and if it's if it was the plan to do it from a priori published protocol, always conduct the subgroup analysis to try and explain the inconsistency. But I think that raises another question of should you then report the subgroup analysis and summary of findings table if it appears to explain the heterogeneity that you originally faced from the pooled effect? So again, going back to our favorite review, just to use as a simple example. So first thing to look at is the eyeball tests. So just looking at the estimates here, and really you're asking, can you draw a straight line that crosses all the confidence intervals from these trials? So there are 6 trials, and you can quite clearly see that all the confidence intervals appear to overlap, mainly because all the confidence intervals are quite wide from the individual trials themselves. And then failing that, looking at the statistical tests, but not wanting to use specific thresholds, but I think this is quite clear cut and obvious because I-squared is 0, the p-value is quite high, and there's clearly no heterogeneity just by looking at it. So this is just another example where hopefully you should see that there's quite obvious heterogeneity here. So again, using the eyeball test, can you draw a vertical line that crosses all these thresholds? No. There's just a whole range of data, some reporting, some favoring the control completely, and some favoring the intervention group with confidence intervals well within that side of the graph. So there's a lot of heterogeneity going on here, so you don't even need to look at the statistics here. This is one of the okay, messed up the slide orders a bit. This was one of the nice samples where subgroup analysis did actually appear to explain most of that heterogeneity. So some context is this was comparing two different combination therapies to treat malaria, and there was quite high resistance to one of the drugs in West Africa that wasn't seen in East Africa. So one of the pre-specified subgroup analysis the authors said they would do is split by where the studies were conducted in East and West Africa. You can see East African studies massively favor the intervention. You could draw a straight line between those. The West African studies, there's this top study which has huge confidence intervals, mainly because they had a very little events. But the two Zongo studies conducted in Burkina Faso both found no effect, and the pooled analysis for that subgroup agrees with that. Right, so looking at the pooled effect, it was quite obvious there was some inconsistency going on, but that has now been explained by the subgroup analysis. So I think my question to everyone here is, would you report the subgroup analysis in the summary of findings table, or would you report the pooled effect and then say in the footnotes that you don't downgrade for inconsistency because of the subgroup analysis? Or would you do none at all? So someone said pooled effect. Susan says, I don't know. And that's great. That's what I would say as well. Someone else says pooled effect not needed. So we've got a range of all three. A subgroup analysis is more informative. Subgroup seem informative in this case. Okay, so we've got a range of all three answers here. And Emma says pre-specified subgroup analysis, then it would make sense to include it. Okay, so I think everyone's alluding to reasons that are derived from the grade handbook on this. The grade handbook actually gives some guidance on whether you should report subgroup analysis in summary of findings tables. And they list several reasons that I won't go into because it's quite wordy, but I'll post a link into that later. But essentially it's what a lot of you, great audience, are giving. So was it a pre-specified subgroup analysis? Does it make biological sense? Like, was this, it's pre-specified, but also was it a subgroup analysis that actually makes sense to conduct, and the authors were planning to conduct anyway? Is a subgroup variable a characteristic specified at baseline or after randomization? So what we just said. And also, is there a subgroup difference that's suggested by comparisons within rather than between studies? Which I think is quite important as well. So it's not just looking at the individual studies, but looking at the subgroups themselves for that. So in retrospect, I would actually report these subgroups in summary findings table. So I'll report subgroups as separate summary of finding table studies purely because of the biological reasons given. And was one of the drivers to introduce the new combination therapy here, is because of the huge amount of drug resistance elsewhere. Right. This is another one on inconsistency. So eyeball test suggests that there might be some inconsistency. There's definitely one trial doesn't overlap, and quite a high I-squared. But as well, we've also got some potential imprecision here. So if you look at confidence intervals for this, it's going from 32% reduction to just touching the point of no effect. So mixing two up, because grade isn't always it's not just about treating domains individually. Would you downgrade for inconsistency, imprecision? One of each? None? Is that for inconsistency or imprecision, Aphrodite? Or both? Inconsistency. Great. I think most people are touching on inconsistency for this one. So I would agree. And this is one of the points that the two domains often get conflated, because obviously if you're going to get hugely variable results, then they with even ratings between equal weightings between the trials that are contributing to that meta-analysis, it's not unsurprising that you would also see a wide confidence interval from your pooled analysis. So it's and this one thankfully isn't too wide, but it's still relatively wide. And then it's important to look at whether it's the unexplained variability within each trial that is actually contributing to this confidence interval, or whether it's the just imprecision itself. I think, yeah, from this one you can sort of see its inconsistency. Right, flicking back because I had my slides in the wrong order, but this is one that I wanted to illustrate what I meant earlier by the different types of heterogeneity. Is it this one actually? Is this one? Sorry. So here you can see from an eyeball test that virtually none of the confidence intervals overlap with each other. You've got very high I-squared here, incredibly high. Actually, if you look at the individual trial results and then the pooled effect itself, what you see is all of them actually have very precise measurements around an effect size that all strongly is in favor towards the intervention here, which again, apologies, is another malaria intervention. So this is intermittent preventative treatment in children. So giving children malaria drugs every season or every year to prevent malaria in areas where there's seasonal transmission rather than perennial transmission. So yeah, so this is what we actually define as quantitative heterogeneity, rather than, if we flip back here, this is what we would call qualitative heterogeneity, because actually the differences in each trial leads to a different conclusion. So you would say from the Tanzanian trial that AL6 clearly works compared to AQ plus XP. But if you're looking at Zongo, you would say the opposite. So this is what we normally call qualitative heterogeneity. But here's quantitative in that the conclusions themselves don't change. So if you were to word this, you would always say that IPTC favors against control. And the magnitude of effect is actually quite strong within all these trials. But because the results are so precise, you appear to get this inconsistency from the I-squared. So actually, despite the I-squared, despite the failing the eyeball test, I personally wouldn't downgrade for inconsistency here, and that might be a little bit controversial, because what you've got is a strong effect from every trial. So the wording of the conclusions would be the same, but feel free to debate with me in that in the chat. So giving some examples and an example of where you would consider both the same. So just a quick summary, because I've ran over a bit with talking. So decisions downgrade for imprecision and inconsistency may sometimes rely on both objective, so statistical, hard numbers, but also subjective measures. So talking about what we define as clinically important results when we're looking at imprecision, looking at the type of heterogeneity you have when we're considering inconsistency. Ideally, some of these are informed by content experts and guideline development groups, APRI, but we don't always have that luxury. And the main one, stop using thresholds for I-squared to inform your inconsistency decisions. If people dig deep enough, there are definitely reviews where I'm a first author on where that is in my method section as well, that we would downgrade for inconsistency if I-squared was above X, Y, or Z. But yeah, stop doing that. And then finally, sometimes the two domains do overlap, and it's easy to get conflated for both. But it's also that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't downgrade by one for both domains as well.